Hello and welcome to part 3 of Capitalist Realism with Professor Marchia and his kitten support, Professor Obriel. Hello, Obriel, chilling there. So we get the cat in here. Okay, so now we are going to talk about, so thus far we were just talking about the theory of capitalist realism and explaining it to you. Now we're going to talk about how Fisher sees it as it applies to mental health. And then we're going to do the final video on media, the one you all have been waiting for. We're going to talk about how all of these things connect in a way that involves the media in a very direct and pervasive fashion. All right. So first, I want to go over the case study, let's call it, of mental health and capitalist realism, and then we can move on to that final part. So to start with, on page 19, Fisher says that mental health is the paradigm case of how capitalist realism operates. He says that the mental health plague in capitalist societies would suggest that instead of being the only social system that works, capitalism is inherently dysfunctional and that the cost of it appearing to work is very high. So what do you think about that, Professor Marchia?
Yeah, so I think he looks at, right, we sort of talked about broadly how capitalism has aspects that are dysfunctional. And I think one of the places that he sees this really in a really key way as an author that struggled with mental health himself is the way in which it actually even pervades down into how we, think about the world, how we think about ourselves, and how it affects our mood, right? And usually we think about mental health as, and this is not to say it doesn't have biomedical components, right? But on some level, it's also affected by the world around us, right? I mean, if you think about things like trauma or different experiences that people have, or right, how they think about their future, right? The future of them or their family or their children or their country, right? Or how they, how much agency do they have in their lives? How much freedom? How much control? Right? These are all things that are affected by factors that are sociological, right? And so he says, one of the key ways that we can see that the system is not functioning is seeing, just how many people in countries that are, even within countries that are wealthier, right, where they're, you would think humans are flourishing. We're actually seeing a lot of people that are not, right? And this is not something that, human beings haven't sort of magically changed, right? This isn't a natural state that there's so many people that are in so much despair, right? This is on some level of reflection of the world that we're living in.
Yeah, absolutely. And to think about trauma as only a biomedical condition does exclude the sociology of mental health and trauma, I think, entirely. And Fisher talks about that a decent amount here. He talks about this book by Oliver James called The Selfish Capitalist, where there's that idea that instead of treating it as incumbent on individuals to resolve their own psychological distress, that is, instead of accepting the vast privatization of stress that has taken place over the last 30 years, we need to ask, how has it become acceptable that so many people, and especially so many young people, are ill? And there, I think it's very important that we think about these differences across countries and groups, because as you were describing, populations that are the most affluent globally, right? So if we think about people that live in Western societies, they should have the best mental health compared to other populations from a sociological level, because the sheer degree of trauma as experienced by the inability to meet basic needs like healthcare, food, and clothing, and the like are less, essentially not healthcare. Nobody has healthcare anywhere, but ostensibly people are able to afford to eat food and are not starving in the same way people are in developing countries. And obviously trauma is staggered, right? Even within this country, I imagine trauma is staggered racially along racial lines. Black, Indigenous, POC individuals are probably experiencing more trauma because they're experiencing more direct experiences that are harrowing harrowing, and not only because of them as individuals, but because of systemic processes that have been placed that are going to make them more likely to
Yeah,
experience
by
trauma.
some estimates, 3 times more likely.
Wow. Yeah, that's totally makes sense to me. But then now when we look at the people that are least likely to be traumatized at the sociological level, let's say, right? People that might be like middle or upper middle class or higher, generally white folks in Western societies, you'd think, you know, they must be doing well under, or somebody must be doing well under all. So what is this elusive group of people that are doing well? But no, in the Oliver James text further down, I think on page 35, he gives a pretty interesting empirical report that I can't find it right now. You all can look it up on page 35, but there is some data that talks about how the rates of distress, he calls it, doubled between people born in 1946 and 1970. For example, 16% of 36-year-old women in 1982 reported having trouble with nerves, feeling low, depressed, or sad, whereas 29% of 30-year-olds reported this in 2000. And so this was 20 years ago. We haven't even considered the traumatic last 2 decades, and we haven't considered the simply traumatic 2020, right? And this is a study of British women. And so you'd think women in Britain are in that category of like, you know, least likely to experience trauma, but no, every category of people are experiencing increase in rates of distress is what they're calling it, but we're going to be more sensitive and call increasing rates of mental illness of various kinds. And so where is this coming from? Is it only coming because of everybody's individual brain chemicals? Is that the extent of the explanation of why? And if so, then why were there less, or like maybe not necessarily, I mean, we have to account for things like reporting, but ultimately what is missing when we only pathologize and medicalize mental illness? What do you think is the result of that? What is it missing, so to speak?
Yeah, I mean, so it's missing on 2 levels. I mean, first, accounting for, you know, yes, there's biomedical explanations, but also a lot of it has to do with our own individual history and past experiences. But as sociologists, we know our individual histories and past experiences are tied in with an entire social structure. Right? There's a whole, you know, there's a whole set of explanations for how we get to where we are in lives, and these have sociological bases, right? So even though we have a certain experience that's traumatic, you have to imagine, you know, the likelihood that's going to happen to you, that you're going to have these experiences, depends a lot on your sociological context.
Yeah.
And on another level then, right, so why then would it be the case that we even see this happening in the in wealthier nations in first world, right? I mean, they do have they're definitely less likely to face these traumas, but also in a way this affects our cognition, the way we think about things, right? The fact that we're living in this time where we're, you know, not to be corny or naive, but hope doesn't seem to be something that's very commonplace, right? I mean, you imagine the 1940s British women, right after World War II, right after a very, very traumatic time, right? You still see there's some sort of optimism, right? That the world can still change, that different things can happen, right?
Yeah.
Compare that today, right? We're not, British women are not living in the, you know, the ashes of being bombed, but on some level the actual idea that society could be progressing in some way, that there might be some place we're going that's better, that's missing. And that's, you know, it's so weird to think that even though the conditions could be so much better, the idea that there is no, you know, Mark Fisher talks about this a lot, this slow cancellation of the future, right? The idea that there is some sort of future, you know, whether you want to call it a utopia or even just something better that we're moving towards, is gone. It's missing. It's not something that's a part of how we envision the world anymore.
Yeah, we no longer are allowed to expect progress. And yeah, hope is dead. I mean, it's not naive. I mean, it is naive, right? I mean, to be a hopeful person, to be a hopeful sociologist, I mean, to me, navigating the world is very confusing because I, as an individual, would like to believe that better things are possible and can come. But I also understand that the things as they are kept the way they are via these extremely powerful forces, and these forces transcend any individual to a level that's just shocking when you use a capitalist realist lens. It's become more than the sum of its parts, right? Capitalist realism is now no longer about not only people or institutions, it's really about almost this like cognitive force that exists that sort of determines how we feel in every given moment. And a lot of that is really, to me, the center of Fisher's contribution, is making us realize just to what extent people across the spectrum of capitalist society have internalized hopelessness, and somehow that is good, but for whom? Like, going back to like who is it working out for? What population is served by this? And I even, like, not to get to no, I'll skip that. Let's not go there. So on page 21, Fisher speaks of this idea of reflexive impotence. All right, he says, I want to argue this is not only okay, no. While French students is giving an example of why French students go out and protest and British students don't do so much, he wants to argue that this is a matter not of apathy nor of cynicism, but of reflexive impotence. So he's creating this concept. They know things are bad, but more than that, they know they can't do anything about it. But that knowledge, that reflexivity, is not a passive observation of an already existing state of affairs. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So he goes on to say, I'm just going to add a couple more quotes and then we can talk about it, right? He goes on to say further down, it is not an exaggeration to say that being a teenager in late capitalist Britain is now close to being reclassified as a sickness. And it is an exaggeration. Fisher likes to write sort of in these like very powerful terms, but this further, he says, by privatizing these problems, by treating them as if they were caused only by chemical imbalances in the individual's neurology and or their family background, any question of social systemic causation is ruled out. And then he talks about this idea of causation versus what is the word he uses? So causation versus like explanation, right? So yeah, the reason a person might be depressed, the explanation for that is that there are imbalances in their personal pathology, in their personal medical condition, right? It's a personalized explanation. But is that the cause? Is the chemical imbalance the reason the person's brain has chemical imbalance? I mean, that seems like a tautology. Where is the cause? And Fisher is saying maybe a lot of the cause exists at the societal level, not at the individual's brain level, right? The individual's brain is what is being affected by their traumas and experiences, and all of those happen at the societal level. So there's this social causation for these things that are completely ignored. And when we are focused on only the medical aspects, it's easy to say, okay, everyone's unhappy because everyone's sick, and that's true enough. Lots of people are really sick, but everyone's unhappy because question mark, you know, is it because they're sick, or are they sick because of something else, and that something else exists at the sociological societal level?
Right. And I think it's both. I think it depends at what mental health problem you look at. I mean, there's, you know, not to discount the biomedical stuff because that is real, but
Absolutely.
it doesn't seem to fully explain the just complete explosive rates that we see anymore, right? It's not standardized across time where, let's say, whatever, making it up 5% of the population has some sort of unfortunate chemical imbalance that's genetic. Well, if you see that percentage rising and rising and rising, there's something else that's happening, and that's sort of where the explanation of sociological factors comes in. And then also you're right that it's impacted by, you know, by other things, right? Trauma makes it worse, right? You might be someone that started out sort of with the healthy brain chemistry that repeated experiences have changed, because that's also malleable as well.
Right. And so yeah, it's not at all to discount them biomedical explanations. Obviously they're true, and they're very important to think about, but they are the extent of the mental health discourse in capitalist society. Because if we expand beyond that, if we start looking at causations outside of the individuals, then we really do need to ask ourselves that why have we created a socio-political economic system whereupon this sort of medical condition is pervasive and increasingly pervasive over time. I mean, there's plenty of data that shows this, that, like you said, the sociological question here is not, oh, why are people mentally sick? It's that, why are the trends in mental illness changing in ways that show that more and more and more and more and more people identify as being sick in some way or another.
Right. And also, I could add that something in the DSM-5, right, the Diagnostic Manual for Mental Illness, there's a lot of different symptoms people might present that might determine whether or not they have a mental illness. But one that sort of is pervasive throughout the manual is one symptom of having particular illnesses would be ability to hold down a job, which is not a medical category at all, right? And yes, whether or not you can hold down a job might be symptomatic of some sort of mental issue, but also it's a labor market thing as well. I mean, if there's a decreasing number of jobs, that would directly correlate to an increasing amount of mental illness. There's something there that doesn't explore the way in which, right, it acts as if having a job is a neutral, not a political category.
Yeah, and it's interesting with labor because on the one hand, you can see these trends of like mental illness increasing with lower rates of jobs. And I haven't looked at a lot of the new data from 2020, which I'm sure will be fascinating to see as the economy starts weakening substantially, what happens to rates of like mental illness. And I would anticipate and hypothesize that there's some strong correlations there. I don't know. We'll have to see when the data comes out. But at the same time, I have lost my train of thought for a second. What was I saying? Trends in mental health and
2020 and
2020. All right, we'll come back to that. There's no reason for me to try and remember a specific point when we can talk about other things. All right, so the other thing that Mark Fisher talks about here is this idea of depressive hedonism. And we'll come back to this concept when we talk about how media ties into all of this, right? So he describes depressive hedonism in on page, well, I didn't write the page number down. Wonderful. But at some point he talks about depressive hedonism in one of these pages, and students and you can find it eventually. But it's this idea that people are experiencing a different type of depression in capitalist realism than the traditional DSM-5 criteria. Oh, actually, I just remembered what I was going to say before, so we're going to come back to that for a second. So yeah, when you think about the labor market, it's like, yeah, not having jobs is definitely going to correlate with higher rates of mental illness, but then having jobs can also be, so like jobs can be very brutal, right? They can be very hard. Talking about alienation, when we go into Marx and the alienation of labor, how performing the same repetitive tasks over and over and over again affects the worker at a level where they're disconnected from their society, they're disconnected from themselves. It puts them in this like box of like being a production engine, and that is also not good for mental health. So within capitalism, we have either work and have difficulties with wellness and happiness, don't work and have difficulties with wellness and happiness. And so to me, that's also interesting.
Right. Yeah. It's that's what makes it systematic. Whether or not you succeed or don't succeed on the terms and conditions of the economic system, both have these problems associated with it, right? And if success and failure are both correlated with a failure to achieve a level of mental well-being, it would appear to me something's quite wrong.
Right, exactly. And so when he's talking about depressive hedonism, he's talking about this new type of, I'm not going to call it depressive disorder. I don't want to confuse it with the medical condition, but he's talking about this idea of like this like listlessness, a different type of new kind of alienation where people are so like unhappy on some level and unfulfilled, and they have this sense that something isn't right and something is never going to be right. And we talked about this, the death of hope, like there's no hope. And within that context, he talks about the Western audience. I think this is very, very prevalent to Western folks. Specifically, the Western individual has started to really sort of engage in like this sort of deep hedonistic behaviors, like watching TV's Netflix for 24 hours and just like trying to numb your emotions in any way possible, like eat anything in front of you, like just, constantly engage in these like behaviors that end up making them feel worse. And that's a way to sort of cope. It's a coping mechanism against capitalist realism that ends up sort of reinforcing this idea that nothing can be done, right? We can't do anything, so we're just going to delve into this complete, isolated, personal mind world where we're just like watching TV constantly, and that's where the media comes in. We now, with the internet, live in this entertainment matrix that we're going to talk about maybe in the next segment, where it's so easy to practice that not reflexive hedonism, that depressive hedonism, that idea that, okay, I cannot be an active agent in any kind of change, and I am aware that things aren't quite right and I can't do anything else about it, so I'm just going to recognize the limitations and the hopelessness while ignoring it completely by engaging in complete hedonism. What do you think of that?
Because it's, there's one thing that's really important towards having um, a positive mental health and outlook is your agency, right? And so we have this weird paradox where, on one level, when it comes to the media we consume, we have so much agency. We have 2,591 new Netflix shows, right? And so we feel as if all these options for satisfying ourselves are at our fingertips. At the same time, right, all these other options for our lives are foreclosed, right? All these different, whether it's in our social mobility, whether it's in, what we do with our time, right? The jobs that are available, even, pursuing our passions and recreations, even, what's possible for our life's choices, those are steadily decreasing, right? More and more we have to sort of conform to a very narrow set of choices in that level. At the same time, the things that we think of as our personal choices are these sort of consumer choices that are more, there's more choice there than ever, but it's not a choice that's meaningful.
Yeah, that's brilliant, actually. And that's exactly what I was struggling to say, is that this like hedonism is a negative way to describe sort of this like choiceless agency of like, okay, I don't really have the ability to control my future. I don't have the ability to provide myself and my family with like this elusive concept of happiness, but I have the ability to choose from a lot of different streaming platforms, and I have the ability to buy stuff on Amazon, and there's a lot of things I can buy. So like that's where, like, you're totally right, agency becomes completely tied to consumerism. You're agentic in what you can consume in the Western world, but you are not agentic in any other aspect of your life.
Yeah, it's like you can watch 50 different reality shows of people living in luxurious houses, but you can't own a luxurious house, and that's,
Yeah.
a meaningful disconnect.
Yeah, exactly. It's sort of like, yeah, it's the hyperreality thing that we'll come to in the next video. I think the hyperreality concept is a real contribution of this paradigm that I think will, hopefully we're going to end on a positive note, and not this video necessarily, but we're going to move towards thinking about how capitalist realism can in fact provide hope. Sorry, you're
Yeah,
gonna.
I do want to say, for those sort
Yeah.
of struggling with this, I think the overall prescription from this book is actually very positive and optimistic, and I guess maybe we'll wrap up with that.
Yeah, let's end this segment with that, and then we will well, I want to say one quote and we'll end with that. Actually, this is something he says in the book on page 37, and he's talking again about all these things that we're saying with mental health. And he talks about how mental health has been depoliticized. The current ruling ontology of capitalism denies any possibility of the social causation of mental illness. He says that it used to be a political issue maybe at some point, but now we don't think of mental illness as a political issue because it's so individualized and medicalized. So he says, and I think this is a powerful statement, the task of repoliticizing mental illness is an urgent one. And I think that's not something people think about a lot. And I wanted to throw that out there and give some people something to think about. Anything you want to add to that?
No.
Yeah. All right. So we will come back with our segment on media shortly.